So, Maya, we have you on the show today to talk about a lot of topics. One in particular is what fiscal policy will look like post pandemic as we deal with the COVID-19 health crisis and how we climb out of the recession we're currently in as a result of it. But I think I'd like to kick off this conversation with something a little more hot off the press. CRFB just issued a paper on common myths, or I guess debunking common myths relative to debt issues. I think today's publication had three myths that were highlighted. One of them had to do with interest on the debt and how low interest rates now could make it very easy or even non-consequential to have such high debt levels. And I guess I want to hear your take on why that may or may not be the case.
Good. Well, thanks, Chase. And yeah, hot off the presses. One of the things that we're hearing about, I should start by saying it is so common for people to search for and develop theories for why deficits don't matter, because dealing with the deficit and debt is hard work, and pretending that you can borrow and there is no problem, no downside with that, that makes everything easy. So obviously, it's politically desirable. But interest rates is one of the more interesting issues in overall economy these days because they are so much lower than any of us would have ever thought they would be at a time when the deficit is this high. And so that fact is giving an opening for people to rethink the issue and say, well, maybe deficits don't have such a profound effect because interest rates are staying low. I think there's a big macroeconomic point, which is clearly there is a smaller relationship between interest rates and deficits than we previously thought. But what it doesn't mean is that borrowing is free. And those are the two things that people are conflating. On one hand, yes, interest rates don't respond exactly as we thought they would when it's in the face of deficits. That's true. We need to learn more. But it still means that when you're borrowing, there's a lot of negative economic consequences for doing that. I think the main point is that because you can borrow cheaply, doesn't mean you don't have to pay the bill. If you borrow $1 or you borrow $1 trillion, you still have to pay that money. It means that the time that you're borrowing and not repaying the money, the interest payments are much, much cheaper. And so what we have now is a situation where our interest isn't crowding out all the other parts of the budget from the new borrowing, but we're still going to owe trillions of dollars on the money that we borrowed to fight the pandemic. And I should say that's money I think we did need to borrow, but it's not just poof, disappeared. We're going to have to repay that money. And the second downside of even when interest rates are so low is that if and when they go up, the larger your debt is, the more vulnerable you are to that change. And that's very likely what we will see in the future, carrying a record level of national debt, if and when interest rates go up, will be much more painful than it already will have been.
I think that point is really the really a significant one because it's a hidden risk. I mean, you don't see it there, but the federal budget is now really vulnerable to an increase in interest rates. And in some ways, you're hoping for an increase in interest rates because it would be a sign of the economy picking up again, which we want. But the cost of that is going to be servicing that debt is going to be much more expensive.
I want to keep going down the line here. The two other myths that CRFB was hoping to debunk with this particular publication had to do with how much debt we were to be accruing and basically how quickly it could go away. One of the myths was the thought that we'd be able to pay down the new debt from the pandemic as quickly as we did post World War II. And then the third myth was that the Federal Reserve could basically buy debt without consequence. So can you combine a response to both of those sort of in one answer, Maya?
But we're hearing way too often, we repaid all of this debt after World War II, so there's nothing to worry about this time around. And the circumstances, unfortunately, couldn't be more different. After World War II, the war was over, and we didn't have structural borrowing in place. In fact, our deficit shrunk immensely quickly, and we had demographics on our side. We had mass amounts of people entering the workforce and in their prime working years. Now what we're faced is pre-existing structural deficits to the tune of over $1 trillion a year, an aging population, which is going to make all of these problems much, much worse, and about $14 trillion of borrowing already planned for the next decade. So the notion that we could suddenly turn around and bring that debt down just the same as we did after World War II is completely out of the realm of the possibility. I've been really disappointed to watch people make promises that you could do that. The savings to mimic what we did after World War II are really inconceivable. And at the same time, the notion that the Fed will continue to buy all of our debt is, one, at odds with the mandate of the Fed, and two, ignores the fact that that could cause a whole lot of problems in the broader economy. And so it's basically banking on a pipe dream that none of these normal relationships like pushing upwards on interest rates or inflation will come into play, which they almost certainly will if these dynamics don't change.